Welcome and good afternoon to the audience and the closing keynote speaker, Professor Arndt Brendeke, who is offering a talk entitled Unreadable Things. The University of Texas at Austin and the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies are honored with your presence. Professor Brendeke has studied the genesis of contemporary European culture, the emergence of procedures of knowledge production that seem self-evident today, and the power and information structures of early colonial empires. He heads the Department of Early Modern History at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He also leads the collaborative research center, Cultures of Vigilance, a multi-year, multidisciplinary project that examines the historical and cultural foundations of vigilance. He is author of The Empirical Empire, Spanish Colonial Rule and the Politics of Knowledge, published in 2016, and Die Jahrhundertwenden, eine Geschichte, ihre Wahrnehmung und Wirkung, published in 1999. Professor Brendeke has produced fascinating claims about the complexities of archiving information in early modern societies. However, these archival procedures should not necessarily be read under the umbrella of rationalization and modernization of states. Instead, he claims that this history speaks to us as people of the Spanish world, since our nation state emerged as a reconfiguration of previous but very complex state structures inherited by the Iberian empires. Historizing archives is historizing how power has worked in our continent too, leaving traces of cultural, structural patronage networks and social distrust. Ultimately, Professor Brendeke's work challenges the assumption that power and knowledge are the same, while delving on the one hand in past archival worlds and networks of social actors with interests, and on the other hand, building upon the very theoretically rich traditions of German scholarship in human sciences, what they call Geisteswissenschaften. Our audience will be able to raise questions and engage with the thought-provocative reflections of Professor Brendeke. Remember that you all can pose questions either in Spanish or English, and our team will translate them if necessary. In the end, we will have some space for the final remarks of the organizers of this conference. Professor Brendeke, please take the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Rafael, for this very kind introduction. I'm really honored to close the conference and very much looking forward also to your questions and the discussion. Let me start right away by stating that when I started investigating the function of knowledge within Spanish colonial rule, I concentrated mainly on maps, on official reports, lists of names, and geographical descriptions, like the ones that Rafael has behind him now on his wall. Mostly all these documents were written documents. I spent many months in the archives staring at these documents, reading them. Although I understood for the most part what they contained, a nagging doubt remained. Some documents had ended up in the archives and eventually in my hands because they had hardly been used, if they had been used at all. The nautical charts lying in the archives are a case in point. In the archives are those copies that have probably never been to sea. How then could I trust these sources? Moreover, how could I presume to understand texts by merely reading them when many of their contemporaries failed to do so? In the Council of the Indies, each letter was completely read aloud to all the councillors. Councillors were obliged to listen carefully according to the council's instructions. And yet it still held true when Luis Sanchez, a former secretary of Popayán's bishop, stated in 1566 that, quote, "Las Indias no se entienden," unquote. He spelled out what Juan de Wando, the man who subjected the Council of the Indies to an official visita, confirmed 5 years later. Quote, que en el Consejo no se tiene ni puede tener noticia de las cosas de las Indias sobre que puede y debe caer la gobernación, unquote. There are many reasons for this dramatic and persistent ignorance. One reason is that media produce knowledge that is inherently ambivalent. They transmit knowledge about the world, but by doing so, they involuntarily remind the receiver that the part of the world they represent is absent. The only thing that the receiver can directly hear, see, or touch is the medium itself. As a result, the medium also hides a part of the world. These letters, therefore, certainly transmitted some knowledge, but they deny us another kind of knowledge at the same time. They can even generate a kind of epistemic distrust. What if everything is completely different from what is written in these letters? The contemporaries had methods of dealing with this, which I will not go into today. I say this to illustrate that over time, I myself have developed a considerable distrust of simplistic models, both of knowledge and of communication. A simplistic approach to knowledge makes us assume that a growing stock of paper implied both more knowledge and power for its owner. In practice, however, the accumulation of information can also make it impossible to use it efficiently. In simplistic models of communication, there is a sender, a receiver, and a medium of transmission. Such models lead us to believe that information is transmitted purely, at least when no interferences occur. But at least in colonial situations, there is no room for the assumption of anything like pure information, not in such an interest-driven setting, nor under conditions of such distance and inequality. Then, however, all attempts to gauge information by its degree of purity lose relevance. And in turn, it becomes more interesting to see how texts and objects are used politically. A praxeological lens is then required to describe as precisely as possible how texts, people, objects, and procedures interact in concrete spaces, and finally, to elaborate how meanings change depending on the given constellation. That is what I would like to illustrate today with some examples. As readable texts would deserve special interpretation, I will concentrate on what I have put somehow enigmatic as unreadable things in the title of my talk. Let me start with things and then move on to papers kept in the darkness of a Spanish archive, unreadable for centuries. So the first part is about things. When Ferdinand Magellan solicited royal support for his circumnavigation of the world, he had to convince the court of young King Charles of Spain. He managed it with a trick. Holding a, quote, beautifully painted, unquote, globe in his hands, his fingers traced the possible route of the ships crossing the Atlantic and moving down south. The decisive part of the globe had, of course, been left blank. Nobody knew at the time if there was a passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It is obvious that the globe in the hands of Magellan did not contain any kind of new geographical information. It nevertheless conveyed a very important message. Blank space on the globe stood for the ignorance of everybody in the room, including the king, and also, by the way, of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was present at this meeting. And it also highlighted the extraordinary expertise of Magellan, of the man who pretended to find the passage and to fill the void. Once on board, Magellan continued to use similar techniques. One of the few survivors of Magellan's circumnavigation, Antonio Pigafetta, reports that nobody on board really believed that they would find a passage to the Pacific. Then he describes how Magellan persuaded them to keep going. He pretended to have secret information about a small passage. He told the sailors that he had seen the passage on a map made by the famous map maker Martin Behaim, a map that probably never existed. Pigafetta, our witness, learned his lesson. As one of the few survivors, he later toured through European courts and published his memoirs. The story of the circumnavigation became a big sensation. A papal nuncio, the Italian Francesco Chiaricati, even traded objects representing the world that Magellan and his men claimed to have discovered on their voyage. Chiaricati had a globe now painted with the entire route around the world, the manuscript of Pigafetta's memoirs, and some exotica, leaves, spices, and a very beautiful bird. Sometimes the survivor himself also formed part of Chiaricati's circumnavigation show. The example shows how much care was taken to put objects and people into a productive relationship. The thing then validates the person and vice versa. Politics, and colonial politics in particular, quite often resort to such an effective performance of human-object relationships. Such relationships can unfold in various ways, including the following. When the last Inca emperor of the time, Tupac Amaru, was sent to the scaffold in 1572, he silenced the crowd assembled in Cuzco with a movement of his hand and said a few words. Several versions of these last words have been handed down to us. I pick out the most unlikely version of them. A Spanish source puts him an interesting confession in his mouth. Tupac Amaru is said to have admitted that it was a lie when he had claimed to be able to talk to the sun, even if he claimed to have talked to the golden idol, the so-called Punchao. It was a lie. He gave a reason for that by saying explicitly that the Punchao was just a piece of gold and cannot speak. He also explained how his brother told him how to make the people believe that the Punchao could actually speak. He should first fake a conversation with the idol, the Punchao, in a room without witnesses, and then step out and tell the people that Punchao had actually spoken to him. That way, they would follow his orders more willingly. Whoever invented this alleged confession involuntarily exposed a colonial mode of withdrawing power. Here, it very clearly consisted of the destruction of the potency of the object reference. One has to take the object away or disempower it by turning it into a mere thing, into sheer matter. For this to happen, the Inca itself had to say that the object does not speak. He had to say that the object is just a thing. The scene exposes the common trick, the script of how to empower or disempower by creating or destroying an effective object relation. One can find a plethora of examples of that kind, not all as fraught with meaning as in cases where a religious object is at stake. A rather trivial example would be the trick that the Spanish king Philip II sometimes used. When he received supplicants for audience about whose requests he knew little or nothing, he held a blank sheet of paper in his hand, a mere charade which potentially great impact. As the petitioner could not see that nothing was written on the other side of the sheet of paper, he had to assume that the king knew something very specific. The distribution of knowledge and ignorance in the room was effectively tilted by this trick to the visitor's disadvantage. In a way, such constellations are quite trivial. However, I think it would be worth investigating them more closely and more systematically. Two aspects would have to be taken into account. The first aspect concerns the strongly situational nature of such constellations. They do not persist over time the way texts do. They are therefore an excellent starting point to bring another heuristic into play. This heuristic would not assume a linear model of communication or a relatively stable medium such as a text. When we study such situations, We must rather apply a kind of spatial or situational hermeneutics that is able to consider the interaction of several different elements at a given time and place. I have proposed elsewhere to call this a setting analysis. Drawing more attention towards the setting might help us at identifying specific patterns. Usually, for instance, a strikingly triangular structure unfolds in which observers from one corner of the triangle are witnessing the interaction between an object and an actor. Secondly, we have to take into account that the thingness of the object might be key to understand why a specific human-object relationship becomes particularly powerful. I would argue that this is the case if the object is not self-explanatory. It should, even when put in plain sight, maintain a residual mystery. If this is the case, the actor's competence is best staged. If not, if the thing is readable to us, we can dispense the interpreter. Not at least both literary and psychological studies have shown that unequal distributions of knowledge tend to capture our attention very efficiently. They ensure a higher level of engagement. An approach which takes a lack of readability into account leads us towards a model in which a certain nescience, a non-readability, would be a profoundly productive component of politically persuasive communication. Leaving this part to the object protects, as a side effect, the actor from the suspicion of hiding something. The secret must be structural, material by nature. Let us now turn to the probably most effective structure for keeping secrets, the early modern archive. Spain, as many of you know, had managed to create the image of an almost omniscient king. Philip II has been described as a king that just, quote, sat and read, unquote, as the German historian Leopold von Ranke put it. In this image, the king's lack of physical activity was a requisite of epistemic power. A reading king who did not move, but instead received information from the remotest parts of the empire. The idea of such a focal point for political knowledge already gripped the king's contemporaries. In 1632, for instance, Lorenzo van der Hammen wrote about Philip II, quote, "His body was active in only one place, but the activity of his soul stretched and expanded over both parts of the world," unquote. The Venetian ambassadors to the Spanish court marveled at the king's ceaseless writing and reading, and his first biographer, Luis Cabrera de Córdoba, claimed that Philip II had moved the world by means of papers. He sometimes certainly did, but the idea that colonial rule was based on reading is grossly exaggerated. I will illustrate this here with just one example, concentrating on the repository of texts par excellence, the archive of Simancas, which also held most documents sent from the Americas until their translation to Seville's Archivo de Indias in the late 18th century. Simancas was a defensible medieval castle with thick walls, chosen by Charles V as a safe place for storing documents. Charles, however, used the castle as an archive only to a small extent. This changed only under his son, Philip II, and it changed under paradoxical circumstances. While court and government were centered in Madrid, the archive was further developed in the rather distant and small village of Simancas. To be clear, Simancas was 200 kilometers away from court, a distance which corresponded at the time to a journey of several days on horseback and a postal transit time of about 5 days. Instead of centralizing the kingdom's knowledge infrastructure with a library and the archive in close proximity to the places of political decision-making, Spain's topography of knowledge was divided between different locations. The King's Library, 1 day's horseback ride away, the archive, tucked away in the plains of Castile, and Seville's Casa de la Contratación, far down in the south of the country. Hence, the epistemic situation of the King of Spain was quite different from the one enjoyed, say, by the magistrates of Venice or by French ministers who only had to take a short walk through the city to move from places of decision-making to places of knowledge. And distance wasn't the only obstacle. The archive was hard to use for a couple of further reasons. First of all, it was the king's archive. The king explicitly kept for himself the right to decide whether a copy of a document stored in the archive would be handed over to petitioners. The archival statutes of 1588 stated that the persons who had requested a search for documents must not be present under any circumstances during this search, and that they never be provided with an original, but only a copy. Other people visiting the archive for business reasons, like craftsmen, were not supposed to enter halls in which documents were stored either. To this end, statutes called for the establishment of a separate office where, quote, not a single piece of paper or document, whether of great importance or not, ought to be found, unquote. This physical separation of petitioners from the records ultimately made it impossible for the former to know with certainty whether a document existed or not, or to stumble across other relevant papers. Restrictive usage rules were further tightened in the course of the 17th century. The archivist could discontinue any search for documents that had been requested whenever he thought fit to do so. No reading of papers was permitted in the archive by anyone. Copying documents was only allowed in a single chamber of the archive. In both, reading and writing proved difficult in this archive because of a lack of light and warmth. For the sake of protection against fire, both heating the archive and illuminating its rooms with candles had been forbidden. A scribe who spent some years working in the archive stated, quote, "De causa de los grandes fríos que ordinariamente suelen ser los 8 meses del año y ser los originales muy antiguos, la letra mala de leer y no poderlos sacar fuera para copiarse ni entrar lumbre dentro, se escribe muy poco," unquote. In fact, the documents kept in the archive of Simancas were hardly used. The average output of copies requested during the 16th century was 12 copies per year. The number we have suggests a productivity presumably far below that of any institution at court. Even the king himself had severe problems getting information when he needed it. The archive, and with it the texts from the American territories stored there, could not be integrated into the day-to-day political business under these conditions. Quite the contrary. The court constantly lost sight of the archive's holdings, and its distant location rendered it prohibitive to check the archive in matters of daily business. This, however, brings up the question of why the king opted to store these records so far away from court in the first place. Why was the king so fond of bureaucracy, so conscious of the importance of information, not aware that an archive close to court and its bodies of government would render much better services? The only plausible answer is that the distance must also have had advantages. There must have been a logic behind turning written documents into basically unreadable things. Let me make two arguments to explain why their unreadability could have been politically useful. The first argument comes back to what we discussed before, that political communication was most powerful when it combined actors with material things. Here, however, we are dealing with a reverse case, with a separation between material on the one hand, actors and voices on the other. Death was an important factor in this. When a royal secretary or a councillor of the Indies died in Madrid, the stock of papers accumulated during their careers usually came to light and with the potential to start circulating at court. It was ironically, therefore, the death of a courtier which endangered his discretion. The archivist had to seize what refused to die with him, his papers, and to control their afterlife. He considered it a matter of duty not only to conserve these documents, but also and explicitly to avoid their circulation. And Simancas was perfectly suited to meet the demands of such a policy, which aimed above all at stopping the circulation of documents. Given the abundance of written documents at the time, there was often no time to really check the content. The documents were collected, stored, and then kept in the archive to avoid the risk of their circulation, and then mostly forgotten. I do not deny that other objectives like establishing inventories to retrieve information coexisted with the one just discussed. But the duty to keep information available permanently ran the risk of becoming secondary. In practice, precluding knowledge then gained priority over its provision. The archive, I would claim, was used in the first place to stop the movement of papers, to suppress their reading and circulation. My second argument is that we tend to conceptualize the archive incorrectly if we assume that its primary function was to preserve knowledge and make it available. Archives were often ambiguous places that served different purposes at the same time. In Simancas, this can be well shown by the fact that the castle served as both an archive and a prison. It confined papers and people at the same time. We have proof that prisoners were housed here from the beginning of the 16th century up into the 1580s. And all of them were political prisoners. Some captives died in the castle of Simancas, others were executed on royal order. Among the prisoners, we find Christopher Columbus' grandson, Luis Colón, imprisoned around 1551, and also Cristobal Vaca de Castro, the former governor of Peru. In accordance with their rank, some prisoners were allowed to move freely within the castle. The archivist complained, quote, "Los papeles, las obras y los presos y guardas, todos andamos juntos y nos embarazamos los unos a los otros," unquote. He might have remembered when he wrote this letter the case of the Baron of Montigny. Philip had had the Baron executed in the castle archive a couple of years ago. The king had given precise instructions on how the murder was to be carried out. The executioner had come from Valladolid under the cover of darkness. To fake a natural death, the corpse was dressed with a habit that covered the throat. Thus, no one could see the traces of garroting. And also, the news that the Baron had died of a fatal illness was spread at the same time. Simancas, an ideal place to stop the circulation of documents on the one hand and to silence voices on the other. Only after a prisoner managed to set fire to his room did this practice of using Simancas as an archive and a prison end? Ironically, we know about the murder in such detail because the instructions were in writing. Litera scripta manit, a written letter stays, and it actually survived in an archive. All in all, it can be stated that Simancas served for a long time rather as a place of concealment. It stored papers, it locked them away, it turned them into unreadable things. This would probably have been of less surprise for many contemporaries than for us, given that the Spanish word archivo was used in literature to allude to an act of silencing or perennial locking in. In Calderón de la Barca's words, quote, "Tu pecho, amiga, ha de ser archivo, tu corazón, guárdame secreto en él, y no leas por tu vida, aunque en tu poder estén los papeles que te doy." Unquote. Let me conclude with two remarks about first the archive and then about colonial things. The archive of Simancas contained and still contains an enormous amount of knowledge. In practice, however, this knowledge was hardly used, at least not in the sense that the king or other members of court drew specific knowledge from it to make a political decision. As I tried to show, stopping the circulation of documents was an objective of the crown that gained priority over the opposing object of easy access. Why else would the king have opted for an archive in the plains of Castile far away from court? Several initiatives to move the archive to Madrid or Toledo were rejected directly by the king or peddled out time and again. Simply put, Simancas documents were not readable from neither outside nor from within. Since a lack of legibility can be politically productive, the archive nevertheless exercised enormous power. It's like in the case of the king's blank sheet of paper. The archive, by its presence, tilted the supposed distribution of knowledge to the king's advantage. At least for colonial things, common law's principle res ipsa loquitur does not apply. The things do not speak for themselves. Others did. The human-object relation was colonized in many ways, and certainly through the fact that things were separated from voices and no agency of the one of the other allowed. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor Brendeke, por su presentación. Sin duda nos deja muchas preguntas e inquietudes estimulantes sobre la forma en la cual pensamos en el archivo y a veces interpretamos mal o interpretamos de formas quizá anacrónicas o proyectamos desde el presente nuestras visiones sobre los archivos como espacios desde los que se abre el acceso a la información. Mi primera pregunta es justamente sobre esto. ¿En qué medida y en qué momento y en qué contexto podemos localizar ese giro del archivo como un espacio desde el cual se guarda lo secreto y todos estos documentos e información que circula para controlar digamos, los territorios de un estado como el español? ¿En qué momento esto cambia y empieza a estimularse la idea del acceso a los archivos para construir conocimiento y se vuelven espacios para investigadores para construir estos relatos más, digamos, cercanos a la idea más contemporánea que tenemos sobre archivos.
Sí, gracias. Te voy a responder en inglés, ¿vale? I think that, well, there's an easy answer to your question. It's 1844 when Simancas is open to the public. But this is not the point. I think there is a rather a drift towards modernity and to the idea that knowledge and the accumulation of knowledge is key to base government on it. And the interesting thing in the Spanish case is that we have very early traces of such ideas as expressed by Juan de Obando. I would claim that it's the Spanish officials who first kind of really proposed this idea of basing governance on knowledge, but they didn't do it, or they did it just halfway. So the relaciones, for example, are a good case in point. They ordered for, they sent this questionarios, they had this material, but then when you look at it in the archive, you see it's kind of virgin. It's not used, and some parts of the knowledge comes down into some documents, and for example lists of rivers or something like that. This is possible to trace, but no say political usage was made of it. This was a disappointing moment in my research, that I realized that my hero project failed in a way. And then when we can start reconceptualizing it and try to understand secondary functions of all this doing, but then you kind of unfold a kind of a world with a multiplicity of functions and also contradictions in these functions. I think this in the end is beautiful, but it's harder to explain and harder to swallow, especially for us living in modern times and wanting things quite simple and quite straightforward. Thank you.
Gracias, Professor Brendeke. We would like to encourage our audience to ask some questions, and there is one from Professor Adela Pineda. She writes the following, and she can ask it in person. You're muted, Professor Adela.
Thank you, Professor Brendeke, for this fascinating talk. Thinking about hiding knowledge and circulation as a kind of like a vehicle to exercise power. I was just thinking on the opposite, and this goes along with Rafael's question, but from a different angle. Thinking about the digital age, I found that quote in a book by a contemporary German theorist, Ito Steyer, who is studying the overaccumulation of information. And this quote comes from the NSA website where in 2012, where it says, it succinctly frames the NSA main problem, how to extract information from the truckloads of data. It's not about the data or even access to the data. It's about getting information from the truckloads of data. Developers, please help. We're drowning, not waving in a sea of data, with data everywhere, but not a drop of information. So my question has to do with kind of a similar logic, but from quite an opposite situation, where now data circulates so much that it obscures or obliterates what it hides. And I don't know what you think about that.
Yes, I thought, of course, a lot about it, and there's a parallel because it has been too much information. The 16th century, it still is too much information. So it's always about selecting your sources and applying a method to find what kind of information is really relevant for your decision making procedure, whatever that is. And usually people you need more than just a flat world of extended information. We need a certain quality, and sometimes it simply comes down to trust. So, and this is the moment where a person comes into play to kind of to end this deadlock of too much information. Also, not only too much, but to simulate information, because then it's becoming all gray noise, and you cannot decide what is really relevant. So you need someone as giving it a kind of spin, or selecting for you and saying this is the important thing. And in politics, and this is why it's so interesting to look at situations, there's a specific situation where this kind of tilts into the decision making. And decision making means also forgetting all this information, closing the eyes in a way, and taking just one path of so many possible paths. So this is really interesting, and this is why I think we have to study specific situations which are often actually designed to break this deadlock of too much information, and to see when an actor occurs on stage, in the office, or wherever it takes place, and how this influences the decision-making process. This is only part of an answer. One could discuss a lot about this problem, of course. Thank you for your question, Adela.
Thank you.
Bueno, también hace un rato estábamos en la reunión del panel 4, que fue sobre las relaciones geográficas, justamente. Usted sabe que las relaciones geográficas, en el caso de UT Austin, son uno de sus más grandes tesoros, y ha sido una de estas grupos de fuentes, de corpus archivísticos muy estudiados por académicos de todo el mundo, por la fascinación que producen, por los mapas, etcétera. Pero es interesante ver cómo usted interpreta todo este proceso de compilación de información como una suerte de proyecto fallido, ya que en España los cosmógrafos no compilaron la información que aquí se recopiló en el Nuevo Mundo. ¿Qué piensa usted, o más bien, piensa usted que esta lectura, estaría usted de acuerdo con que esta lectura podría complejizarse si tenemos más en cuenta no solo las expectativas del imperio y su no realización, sino entendemos también la construcción de estos documentos desde acá, desde cada una de esas localidades? ¿Cuál sería la forma de aproximarse a ellas como conocimiento si partimos de que la función con la que se hicieron en realidad no se efectuó? No sé, es apenas como una reflexión abierta, pero no sé qué podría usted decirnos.
First of all, I have to stress that my perspective was a particularly European one. I wanted to understand how the Spanish government was able to rule over territories which they just simply didn't know personally. So how could they base decisions on such stuff? So this is only part of the answer. You also asked if there is a kind of other side of this information, and I have to confess that I have not studied with the same detail this other side. I have studied many relaciones geográficas, but from the ground, how the group worked, how the group tried to figure out something about the place or the region. I think this is extremely interesting, and sometimes it's really one wants to know much more about how this group, for example, was who was member of this group. The indigenous part sometimes is silent, so we know only that they painted, for example, the map. Sometimes we have traces of how the group was composed, and sometimes, what I find also very interesting, are the voids, the answers, or the points to which they don't answer. Because, and this is so fascinating, because in theory it's a strict scheme you have to adapt to, but they interpret it also as, in some cases, as an occasion to discuss their own perspective and reflect their own perspective. But in any case, this is addressed to us as historians nowadays, because in the 16th century, I think that Juan López de Velasco went briefly through it, and maybe Thespedes, and then it just ended up in desks and chests. Maybe to our luck, maybe this is the way it survived, and we have this precious information. But this is a kind of the situation I want to explain. There was another question, I think.
Yeah, we have a question. Camila Ordorica asks, I am interested on your thoughts on similar cases like the Simancas archives, one where archives have been housed in prisons. I am thinking, for example, on the General Archive in Mexico, which is currently housed in a 19th century panoptical prison. And I would say the same for the case of the Colombian National Museum, which was previously the archive. So why these archives, these early modern and 18th and 19th century archives were hosted in prisons? What is the hidden part of these histories of archiving information in which information doesn't seem to be open and used for knowledge, but just for secrecy?
Yeah, first of all, Simancas is not the first case of such a weird combination of prison and archive. For example, the Tower of London was used the same way, and the Castello Sant'Angelo in Rome also. So there is clearly a pattern, and I think it is rather for practical reasons. You need a building which is very close, where you cannot enter easily, and where people who are imprisoned cannot communicate with the crowd either. So there must be a kind of an architectural pattern. In the Spanish case, the interesting thing is that it's not only a castle, but it's a castle far away from court. As it was established, of course, the court was closer, because the court was sometimes in Valladolid, so it's about 20 kilometers. But then during the 16th century, it really becomes a periphery, and it still is today. And many historians in the 19th and 20th century complained about this situation, especially, for example, Catalan historians, who said, why are our documents in Castile and then in this kind of still prison where we have theoretical access, but it's still hard to use. And yes, Mexico City, of course, is a very modern case, and I think, if I remember that correctly, it was about either to destroy the building and build a new one, or to protect it. And putting the archive was a way, kind of happy coincidence, to preserve the prison with a new function. I worked there, and I really found it fascinating that the documents are actually in the cells, and there are still the doors, the metal doors between the archive documents and the readers. So it's a fascinating trajectory of this architectural pattern.
Thank you, Professor Brendeke. We have another comment from the audience. Cesar Salgado wrote, "This was a remarkable, eye-opening talk. So many scholars consider Simancas as the height of readability for the exercise of imperial power. Puerto Rican reformist historians in the 19th century, such as Alejandro Tapia and Salvador Brau, considered it as the key of national historical self-discovery, the information storehouse in which all questions about local identity, sovereignty would be found. It might be that it stored unreadable things in the 16th century, but by the 19th century, they were read plentifully and with productively decolonial purposes."
Yes, yeah, Cesar is absolutely right, of course, that as we discussed before, there is a long history of this institution, and it changed in the 19th century. But still in the 19th century, it was hard to get access for foreigners, for example, especially from Protestant countries, to the archive of Simancas. And also, I would say there is a strong fascination still existing. If you walk over this hanging bridge and go into the castle, it's really as if you would like to step into the secrecy of this empire. And then you have this abundance of material. It's really fascinating. And what I want to add also is that we still kind of are, as historians, resembling the idea that we are in a kind of privileged observer position if we are in the archive, surrounded by all these documents, as if everything would be available. And this, of course, is a tricky feeling that can blind us to what is lost, what is not in the archive, what you cannot find, and so on. So this epistemic power scheme that the king was ascribed to, that he's sitting and reading, it was a historian, Ranke, who said, sitting and reading, this is power. And so power is what we do also, because we are in the focal point of all this knowledge. So there's an interesting epistemic, I think, history of this idea. So as charming as it is that all this survived, it's also still an ambivalent history. Yes, the lettered city, of course, of Ankaramas. Thank you.
Justamente pensaba en cómo historiadores como Ranke e incluso Fernand Braudel siempre han caracterizado a Felipe II como el monarca papelero o empapelado que firma y firma papeles todo el día y a partir de eso gobierna. Pero tu modelo es distinto en la medida en que enfatiza la producción casi que de ignorancia, no sé si sea exactamente la palabra, pero sí como de, en la medida en que estos papeles circulan limitadamente, pero proliferan, el control del Estado imperial radica en que los funcionarios limitan el acceso, pero también en que los funcionarios hacen parte de redes de patronage, de clientelas, en las que persiguen sus propios intereses y a partir de allí el monarca gobierna como en la medida en que la gente se controla entre ella. Y es muy interesante ver cómo esa idea de clientelismo y de relación entre clientelismo e información tiene resonancias en las formas en las cuales se ejerce la política hoy día en toda América Latina. No sé si quisieras ahondar un poco más en esta relación entre archivos o información y circulación de esta información dentro de redes clientelares y de funcionarios cuyo poder radica no en poder leer documentos masivamente, sino en justamente controlar y limitar la circulación de esa información?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, and it's hard to answer. But what I would like to say is that it's quite common that politics takes place on two different levels, and that there's always one level which is the level of personal interests, of relations, of clientelism, you name it. This is just human nature, that you have relations and that you use them, and also to the advantage of yourself or others. This always takes part, and this is usually covered by, and then it comes down to different historical styles, but in this case it's a new style of an objectivity and also a rationality of bureaucracy, which of course to a certain degree is happening. But if you overstate it, and already the contemporaries did overstate it and say, like Juan de Ovando, everything is knowledge now, then this is clearly an attempt to cover that there are interests at stake. So you split the complexity of the world into two layers, and one is kind of perfectly rational, and then there is another, an abyss of clientelism, of social relations, kind of in the darkness, hidden behind this rational, this postulate of rationalism. And this certainly is maintained until now in different degrees and different, how to say that, different assemblages. And maybe I wouldn't even say that that there's more distance in Latin America. It's just a different style to deal with these things, I would claim, but it's hard to compare that. We will have, by the way, a conference on corruption and its contribution to state building within 2 months, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Also with colleagues from Latin America, but also from Spain and from Northern European Protestant countries, who usually claim that they are on the kind of highway to modernity. But then you realize, of course, that corruption also takes place there.
Justamente, bueno, primero, there is a comment by Cesar Salgado.
Right.
Say, that's a great answer. Just the most bridge at Simancas is a great metaphor of its secrecy and strategic unreadability. Y justo pensaba en cómo, digamos, si uno afirma que en el Imperio Español, en esta producción masiva de información, lo que está ocurriendo no es una producción de racionalización del conocimiento para ser utilizada para gobernar mejor, como nos han contado los relatos tradicionales del centralismo y el absolutismo monárquico y el Estado moderno, sino que lo que hay es información que es controlada, que es limitada en su circulación, y unas personas que gobiernan es a partir de ese control.
Right.
Mi pregunta es, y tú ya ibas por allí, pero me gustaría que nos compartieras más sobre esto. ¿Este caso español es particular o es algo generalizado que ocurre en los demás imperios de la temprana modernidad en Europa y en los demás estados? Porque mi concern es hasta qué punto, si reafirmamos como la producción de ignorancia en el Imperio Español, lo que terminamos reproduciendo es la idea de que en Hispanoamérica se produjo ignorancia, pero en el resto de Europa sí se produjo conocimiento. Quisiera que nos cuentes más sobre esto.
This is not my intention. It's very good that you bring up this point, and I also want to stress that it's not about neither falling into the trap of a rosy legend of early rationalization, nor into the one that this is all a hoax. There was an intention to rationalize. People like Juan López de Velasco, for example, I think they were idealists, and also maybe Juan de Ovando when he started. But then when you see that it's one person who is responsible to describe 2 continents, and there's no staff. So what do? You adapt to the situation, or you try to make a kind of career at court. And if you look at this pattern, all these people disappear. The idealists find a way to find a niche in which they work. Juan López de Velasco, instead of writing the whole geography and his history, he's writing poems in the end. Oh, it's lovely, a lovely career, but he couldn't do it because, of course, it was understaffed. If you have that idea, you need a team of, I don't know, 25 persons at least to really keep all this data up to date. And the king didn't finance it. One can ask why, but we don't have a positive answer to that. And well, also Juan de Ovando, I think he was a rational man. And I think that he, in a way, changed the Council of the Indies to a degree of more rationality, because before it was, in a way, worse. But still, he didn't meet the target of what he proposed, which is governance based on knowledge. And I think he lost interest in that. And in the comparative question, that is a very interesting one. And I started the project as a comparative one. And I spent also a month in British archives and a colleague of mine in Dutch archives and another one in the Jesuit archives. And several books have came out and we discussed it very often. And you have the same patterns, but a kind of different setting. For example, in the Netherlands, it's more about finance. It's a structure of stock exchange, what they establish, and so it's the information has a different addressee. It's towards the public, for example, in that regard. So there are interesting difference, and in the order of the Jesuits, there's also an attempt to make everything kind of brutally rational, to find, for example, a scheme of how to judge everyone in the order according to his qualities. There's enormously tables and lists of the qualities in numbers and all quantified. And in the end, this doesn't work. You ask someone, and this guy, is he apt for that job? And so the promotion usually works. So they have also these 2 layers, but they kind of adapt it differently. So the over pattern is I would say universal, and the way it is played it's depending on the political and economic framework of the country at stake.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. We are so thankful for your presence, for your amazing and fascinating research. And I think this is an excellent way to conclude a conference that has explored this question of how archives contain or not knowledge, memories, and what have been the Latin American contributions to these global histories of archives and archiving practices and archival practices. So right now I would like you, Professor Pineda, to maybe offer to us some final remarks. I don't know if Professor del Castillo would like also to conclude this wonderful event.
I would like my colleague Lina to start first because she's the mastermind behind the conference.
Thank you so much. Well, I have the distinct privilege to give some closing remarks on what has been a remarkably different type of international conference. The 2022 Lausanne Alone Conference has now begun to occupy the space of the no longer, for it is now drawing to a close, but it's also poised to occupy the space of the not yet. That's because all of the pre-recorded presentations, live stream videos from Facebook, select working papers, the keynote addresses, and the graduate student reviews of keynotes, discussants, and panelists will all continue to live online beyond the closing words that I and Adela have to offer you today. In short, over the past 2 days and over the course of the past year, we've created the virtual objects of knowledge with Latin American perspectives that will live in the digital archive for the 2022 Lausanne Alone Conference. As Professor Brendeke has noted, archives are indeed ambiguous places that can serve several purposes at the same time. This is not to say that we're imprisoned, but we sort of are in these digital lives that we have. Our conference archives will testify to the established and emerging intellectual and activist communities forming around archival questions ranging from the defense of human rights to archives of memory, enslavement, memory, art, literature, to the interpretation and contextualization of 16th century documents. Rather than tilting the archive's existence to the advantage of the king, however, our effort has been geared towards tilting the advantages of knowledge production to the public, broadly speaking. The origin story for this conference is rooted in the time of COVID. We're also coming upon the 100-year anniversary of the Benson Library. And on Sunday, March 21st, 2021, our beloved and generous benefactor, Teresa Terry Lozano Long, passed away. These circumstances demanded the need for the 2022 conference to take place, and they demanded a rethinking of the international conference precisely because of the circumstances of COVID. And thanks to my initial conversations with Javier Aullero, the interim director of LILAS, and Melissa Guy, director of the Benson Library, we began considering the online option. It began as a hybrid, and then it just Omicron and Delta, we just went all online. And thanks to their encouragement and the continued support of the endeavor by a current director, Adela Pineda, and the input from the digital humanities team of the Benson, we're able to, this is just one side of the Benson, we started to begin to create the event over the past 2 days. And the we here, of course, involves myself and 3 outstanding graduate students, Rafael Nieto Bello, Camila Ordorica Bracamontes, and Jeanette Nunez. Their hard work over the past year helped us conceptualize the conference themes, identify potential speakers, coordinate communications with the close to 30 graduate students who reviewed the work of scholars, of the keynotes, of the discussants, of the panelists, thereby facilitating the growth of professional networks far beyond their own immediate research interests. And we also read beyond our own kind of comfort level by having a reading group around themes related to the archival turn, broadly speaking, in the humanities. So this also, speaking of the 30 graduate students that these graduate students helped kind of with, we all kind of work together in order to help build out these networks. The crew of Not Even Past, Adam Clulo and Gabriela Esparza, has generously facilitated this aspect of the conference. The pieces that these students have written will continue to be published into the summer of this year, so please be on the lookout. So this archive will continue to grow, so it will live on beyond the conference proceedings of this day. And I should also mention that in addition to being excellent mediators of panels and conceptualizers of the conference, the graduate students have Camila and Rafael and Jeanette, they've been doing significant behind the scenes work, including simultaneous translation during the conference proceedings. So all members all panelists could understand each other and engage with each other in these enriching discussions. And speaking of invisible work, Paloma Diaz, Susanna Sharp, and Jennifer Malieu have been an amazing team, making sure all the details were taken care of and wrangling the technological side of things, including Jennifer and Susanna, especially developing the website. And of course, now the past 2 days, managing the Facebook streaming to help the event go on without a hitch. And of course, indeed, we brought together archivists, historians, literary scholars, librarians, curators of collections, legal scholars, linguists, writers, educators, sociologists, anthropologists, and art historians from coast to coast in the United States, from Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Germany, Spain, Florence, and Russia. This has been a truly interdisciplinary global conference that has looked at archives with Latin American perspectives, with the goal towards having an intervention in other places in the world as well, in other disciplines, not just Latin America, of course. And that's something that we can definitely take away from many of the conference presentations over the past 2 days. I'd especially like to acknowledge the enriching exchanges facilitated by our discussants, Sylvia Sanders Garcia, Christina Wasson, Kristen Weld, and Kelly McDonough, who stitched together new ways of thinking from a variety of interdisciplinary perspectives in the panels that we put together here. And so I think that was a very fruitful kind of discussion that emerged from their comments and response to their comments. And I'm still holding with me the thought-provoking, evocative, and moving keynote addresses by Mauricio Tenorio, Cristina Rivera Garza, Gustavo Meoño Brenner, and of course, Arndt Brendeke. Thank you so much for your contributions to this conference, incredibly valuable. And ultimately, our goal is public-facing, although, of course, public-facing and as broadly available as possible, but we know there are people that do not have access to internet. And so there are limits to how a public can engage with an archive. And yet, we offer this conference recognizing the silences that all archives create, while also being cognizant of the worlds that they can make possible and the thoughts that they may make thinkable, with the hopes of helping build communities of learning and healing towards the future. Thank you so much.
I think with that, there is no more to say. Just thank you very much for these 2 enlightened days. I would just say 3 words more. Skeptical, always skeptical about our own findings. Irony, as Mauricio said, but without forgetting hope, as Cristina also told us. I think those 3 words also embrace the community we are. I have to thank deeply my colleagues, Melissa Guy, Lina del Castillo. This is my first ride into Lila's Benson, huge event, and I have enjoyed tremendously and I've learned a lot. My heartfelt thanks to the 3 graduate students, Rafael, Camila, and Janet, and of course, Paloma, Susana, and Jennifer for a great team. Thank you, Arndt. Very nice to meeting you. It's a great way to conclude this conference. I guess my colleague Melissa is also going to say some final words.
Thank you, everyone. And it's difficult to follow both Lina and Adela. But given that this conference in particular was rooted in the Benson and its centennial, I just want to say that my closing message is just simply one of gratitude. Thank you to everyone who participated in this wonderful conference over the past 2 days. I've seen a lot of Lozano Long conferences, and this is the best one so far. I might be a little bit biased, but I think that is the case. I've learned so much from each of you and have a renewed energy. And I think that's the case for a lot of us at Lilas Benson, to consider and reconsider the work that we do on a daily basis and the impact that our work has beyond the walls of our building and beyond the UT campus. Of course, thank you to our keynote speakers, Mauricio Tenorio Trio, Cristina Rivera Garza, Gustavo Meoño Brenner, and Arndt Brendeke for anchoring the conversations in such thought-provoking and careful ways. The format, we've touched on the format. It was new to us, as Lena said, and I want to thank Lena and Rafael and Jeanette and Camila for thinking through the implications of the online format so carefully by crafting a multifaceted schedule with so many entry points that I think gave us a much wider reach, obviously, than we typically have with the conference. And in that case, rather than seeing the online reality because of COVID as a hindrance, you really took advantage of what it could do, right? We know it can't do everything, but you took advantage of every single thing that it could do. So congratulations on that. I think there will be elements from this format that stay with us, not because we're required to use them, but because they have proven so useful. And not just the format, but the, as you mentioned, Lena, the interdisciplinarity and the globality of this one was really striking. And speaking of format, I have to recognize, as everybody has, Paloma Diaz and Susanna Sharp, who undertook the Herculean task of making the technology come together. And we all know that this was not easy. Finally, thank you again to Adela Pineda, my dear friend and collaborator, LILAS director, for your tremendous support. This conference was essentially the culminating intellectual event of the Benson Centennial, and I could not be prouder of what you all have created in this space. So thank you very much.
Although we like the virtual space very much, we hope we see you in person next year in a hybrid, even more avant-garde form. And there is just a message from Susanna. If you want to get in touch with Arndt Brendeke, there is his email, and I think Susanna or Rafael can share it with you guys. So good evening, have a great weekend, and yeah, vivan los archivos.